Can you imagine? I uploaded a photograph, perhaps rarely seen, of Jimmy Savile wearing an OTO robe, and it went viral on my ex account. So, for those of you who perhaps don't know what OTO means, OTO is basically one of the satanic cults. Now, these satanic cults, they're connected to Aleister Crowley. What happens is that they morph into other names, like the Process Church, for example, or other names like the Church of Scientology, or their offshoots. But basically, they're all the same. So, Ordo Templi Orientis, commonly known by the initials OTO, is an occult secret society. It's a hermetic magical organization. It was founded at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, it can be traced back to the German speaking occultists like Karl Kellner, Theodor Rouse, Heinrich Klein, and Franz Hartmann. Its first incarnation was intended to be modeled after and associated with European Freemasonry. So, we're going to talk about how Jimmy Savile connects to Ghislaine Maxwell through the fact that very likely not only was Jimmy Savile a spy for the United Kingdom, but we all know, he was also very close with then Prince Charles, who is now the king. It is Kirby Sommers. It is December 3rd, and we are going to deep dive into this rabbit hole, which I don't believe many people are aware of. And so I came across additional information. So now we know that that's basically the beginning of the OTO. Now, what happened was it was begun by someone, and then the occultist, Aleister Crowley, assumed control of the order. And many of you know what Aleister Crowley looks like. However, just in case, there he is on the screen. And Aleister Crowley, I think there isn't anyone who follows the story of JE. And sorry, I am going to have to use initials for JE because on this platform, it's very fickle. And sometimes using that person's name means that my podcast won't be listened to by anyone and it might just get deleted entirely. However, Crowley sort of maintained uh, this OTO satanic worshiping religion, let's call it. Okay. It's an occult thing. He called it Thelema. And then when he introduced the name and the phrase Thelema, and they're all, again, offshoots of each other. Like literally, they're all basically the same. They're offshoots of each other. But then with this slight change, OTO basically was said to have removed itself from the Masonic sort of like umbrella under which it was. However, based on all of the research I've done, that's not necessarily true. So, for example, I don't have a picture of him to show you, but Jay-Z is a Freemason. And maybe some of you know, and maybe some of you don't know. In any event, Jack Parsons, who I'm going to show you in a second, he's right there. Now, Jack Parsons was a known Satanist. Um, he was a very well known figure in the OTO. He worked with the United States Navy. He worked with L. Ron Hubbard. And if that name is familiar to you, it's because L. Ron Hubbard went on to create Scientology. However, he was also Jack Parsons. And by the way, he's credited with helping uh, the entire NASA program in the United States for being one of the um, initial people to really devote the most important pieces to it. Now, he was a safe proclaimed antichrist. And despite he died a really unusual uh, death. I mean, many people believe that there was some foul play. So he was an explosive expert. Um, he founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He had an explosion in his home, in his lab, um, in Pasadena. Uh, to this day, nobody really knows whether or not that was a real explosion or whether he was unalived. However, what I want to show you is a photograph of Parsons with Robert Molina. Now, the reason Robert Molina is important, and now remember, Parsons is a Satanist, and he's got two best friends, and one of them is Robert Molina. Robert Molina is the father of Roger Molina, whom she married in June of 1986. Now, Maxwell, Christine Maxwell, is one of the twins. Her twin sister is Isabel, and they are sisters of Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, they ended up having three children. And at some point, I'm going to come back. I'm going to circle back to the children and how they are connected to our political life, let's say, how they were introduced into the US government. Because after all, we know that Robert Maxwell was hailed as one of the most famous spies of his time, a spy not just for the UK, not just for Israel, but also for Russia. And we know that it's come to light that JE has always sort of have had this bent. So if you have purchased my books on Leslie Wexner, which are available only on my website, and I'll leave a link for that below, I delve into the occult life of Leslie Wexner, who most people would never think is sort of like Molina or Parsons or Aleister Crowley. But the truth of the matter is that he is. Now, so that being a good friend, and I'm just going to just go finish my thought with the Roger Molina situation. Now, the fact that his father was such good friends and a partner of Jack Parsons, who was a Satanist and who was um, a disciple of Crowley, he too was a Satanist. And so one would have to take an educated guess and say, oh, Roger Molina, his son, who married Christine Maxwell, well, he's a Satanist. And by extension, does that make Christine a Satanist? And does that make her family Satanist? And from the way I look at it and from my research, and I wrote a book, Ghislaine Maxwell, an unauthorized biography, my educated guess and my instincts say yes. And I will explain how this is sort of like it comes around. So a while back on Netflix, they had a documentary called Jimmy Savile, A British Horror Story. Now, clearly, we know that Jimmy Savile got away with everything. Nothing was done. Literally, nothing was done, period. But nothing was done until he died of old age. Um, However, when I watched this documentary, and by the way, all the documentaries on Netflix or Amazon or any of these, they're not real documentaries. They are sort of like telling you what let's say, the power elite. And sorry, I have to use the word elite. We know that they're evil and they don't represent us. They're like the one percenters who basically run the world. So that is what's shown to us via places like Netflix. However, on the Jimmy Savile documentary, and there was a scene that showed that in the early days when the internet became a thing, researchers who heard about some of the horrible things that Savile was being accused of were trying to find victims. And what happened was that they were using a search engine named Magellan, and nothing came up. Now, for those of you who are unaware, that Isabel Maxwell, with her twin sister Christine, were the creators and co-founders of Magellan. Now, Magellan was one of the first curated online search engines. It was created in 1992. It was basically like the yellow pages of the internet. It was published, that book that she wrote for it was published by her father, Macmillan Publishers, in 1994 and 1995. However, it was also, as you probably are becoming aware, if you use, let's say, the search engine Google, you'll see that there's information that is suppressed. And Magellan, the Maxwell sisters, and by extension, the Maxwell family, including Ghislaine, obfuscated any mention of Jimmy Savile to what he was doing. So essentially, the Maxwell sisters contributed, and I've said this on other podcasts and in my books and in my articles, they contributed to protecting Savile, who apparently, they share a lot with, not just the child situation, right? Not just the SA situation, but now we're looking at a an occult connection that goes back hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, and it's part of this world that we have been unraveling. So then the Maxwell sisters in 1996 went on to sell their search engine to Excite. And then she co-founded Shiliat and basically started working in Israel. However, when the Magellan software was created, sort of like bought out by Excite, what happened? Search engines began to show, like these groups where there were people, primarily women, talking about their experience with Jimmy Savile when they were very young girls. And it was only then, after the Maxwell sisters were no longer involved with Magellan, that the search engines started to yield results. And even though they had the results, because we know that this is a top down problem, nothing was done. As I said, and as you know, the only thing that happened was they gave Jimmy Savile a great funeral, and then they removed his headstone. So, what I want to say about, let me just take a look and see if because I want to make sure that I share as much as I can. So yeah, I was a little surprised that I got such pushback from the Jimmy Savile wearing an OTO robe. But I thought, well, gee, there are a lot of people still that are trying to keep things under wraps. I noticed that here on my YouTube channel with some of the commentary that I get. And to be frank, if you're going to do that and leave a nasty comment, I'm just going to block you, so you're never going to see my information again. However, have at it. So there is still a lot of pushback uh, against people finding out the truth. Now, on the screen, you're going to see that Jimmy Savile was featured in a magazine put out by what's called the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Now, the Process Church of the Final Judgment is an offshoot of all of these Satan worshiping groups. And they're connected with, let's say, Charles Manson. They're connected with the son of Sam, so-called serial unaliver, David Berkowitz, whose some of his crimes were frankly used to cover up the unaliving of people that the government did not want to breathe anymore. And these people knew too much, let's say, about banking irregularities. I will do another podcast on banking irregularities and the subsequent silencing of witnesses. So that I want to get back to Paul Bonacci, because he offers us a window into possibly the connection of Bill Gates into what we know as the Franklin cover-up. Those of you who know my work know that I do a lot of Franklin-related work. A lot of that is in my book, Gerald Ford, MKUltra. Again, this is only on my website. I just don't trust Amazon, because these people go to anything I publish on Amazon and they leave horrendous reviews. And for the general public, when they see horrendous reviews, they believe these horrendous reviews. They do not know that I'm a survivor of one of the billionaires in this group, that I was an slave for 8 years, that I traveled to Washington, to San Francisco, to many places with my abuser, that I have written a book detailing my experience called The Billionaire's Woman. They do not know that I know a lot about every person named to date, almost every person from my abuser in the so-called Epstein scandal, which is not standalone. They, like these satanic groups, are all connected. So Paul Bonacci, we all know, was a victim of the Franklin situation. He was abused beginning at the age of 6. Now, one of his alters, he had many alters. That's what happens with MKUltra, mind control. You are abused to the point that your brain splits. Therefore, it is represented like a butterfly. And it's similar to the butterfly, in fact, very similar, the same, that Virginia Giuffre used as her avatar on then Twitter. Now, one of his personalities, as I'm showing you on the screen, only wrote backwards. If you held it up to a mirror, you could read it. However, I do have an image of what he wrote that I've just added to the screen. Now, he talks about some of the names, some of the people that were involved, and we know that to present day, the Franklin situation has been labeled a hoax. So, this particular personality wrote this on August, I believe that's the 17th or something, or the 11th or something, 1991, that he can't really remember too much. Sort of like maybe 1980 is the first. And he remembers a place called the Mystic Triangle on December 22nd. Now, December 22nd, it's interesting because I was just going to say that's an occult holiday, but he goes on to say it was a festival of the time of the red liquid of Christ. And it's also the shortest day of the year. A human boy child was, unalived, and certain things, I'm going to leave that there and you can read it. It's very, very raw. So if you are not able to handle this, then please do not read this. Skip over this part. However, he names a couple of people. Among these, of course, is Larry King. Um, there were what he calls a mixed group of shadows and knights of darkness. Now, Knights of Darkness is also like the Knights Templars. Now, again, you have the Freemasons, you have the Knights Templars, you have the there's a whole bunch of so-called secret society groups that work collaboratively, and so very likely some of these people presented themselves as knights. However, in one of these, he says Steve Gates. And then after that, he writes Jack and a question mark. So because I know a lot about the Franklin situation, I was interesting. I was going to pull it up and I forgot to pull it up. So, but I certainly know what I'm going to talk about, even though I didn't pull it up. So Bill Gates was very close with somebody in Omaha, Nebraska. And basically, that would be the old guy, Warren. Um, that's his best friend, Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett was very much involved in obscuring any mention of anything that was happening there. So he could have been referring to, let's say, Bill Gates, because Bill Gates also had a partner named Steve Ballmer, and also he was also always being compared to Steve Jobs. So it's very likely that either I'm almost convinced that Bill Gates was involved in the Franklin situation because we have seen him repeatedly mentioned alongside JE, and also he was photographed with JE. But I would have no doubt that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were connected with the Franklin situation, and that perhaps Paul Bonacci got confused, and perhaps this alter did not remember these names and combined them. Okay. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that situation. So again, I've written a lot of books. I dive into all of these areas. Um, my latest books on Leslie Wexner, both of them again available on my website, have information on the less like all. I don't know that anyone else has talked about, let's say, the occult side of Leslie Wexner. However, I do. I go into that. And again, the pushback that I received when I put up this image of Jimmy Savile is similar to the pushback I have received uh, when I'm working on the Gerald Ford MKUltra, when I'm working on the Leslie Wexner books, and the same pushback that I received when I worked on the Ghislaine Maxwell book. And by the way, the first person or one of the first people to buy my book on Ghislaine Maxwell, and she did it through my website, was her sister Isabel. And these people are always listening to every one of my podcasts. They join my Substack. They buy my books. They're really watching and listening to everything I say, everything I do, because it involves them. Now, I seem to have a knack, perhaps because I was stuck in a situation where I was part of this world, to piece together these nuggets of information that a lot of people, you look at it and then, we're all so busy and then you move on to whatever you have to do next. And it's not a comfortable let's say, a learning curve when you're looking at this world that has been obscured from us, because the occult does mean obscure, literally. So that when you're waking up and you're realizing, oh my God, have we had, this influence of the dark always. It's quite heavy. And so I understand how difficult it is to absorb. Um, so I will leave it here, and I do look forward to your commentary. Now, for those of there were some people that basically said about the OTO robe, and by the way, I know that this is an OTO robe. They said, "Oh, that's just Jimmy Savile wearing a 1960s hippies outfit." Well, I want to assure you that the hippies did not wear OTO robes like this. All right, they just didn't. And he's got the hand sign signaling the Freemason thing, right? Um, he was more typical. I hate to tell you this, but he was more typical and more like not just Epstein, who has also been outed, but he was more typical of this entire group of people who engage in horrific behaviors than any of us know. And frankly, as far as whatever the government is going to drop, scheduled, I believe, on the 10th, so just another week away, is never going to go into these layers that are beneath the surface um, of the so-called Epstein. I almost want to call it the Epstein slash Franklin slash Finders slash, go on and on. There's a bunch of PDF files that just, connect to Bush back in the 1960s, back in the 1950s, back. I mean, it's just for me, because I do this every day. It's just never ending. Again, like the OTO morphing into something else and something else, so too do these groups like Savile and Epstein and the Finders. They're all part of the same thing. With that, again, I look forward to your commentary. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye.